European imperialism in Africa. When the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. They said, "Let us pray." We closed our eyes. When we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land. Bishop Desmond Tutu. The definition of imperialism is as follows. Industrialized nations were seeking other lands, those European countries that went through the Industrial Revolution. This became known as the Age of Imperialism. The definition is the takeover of a country or territory by a stronger nation with the intent of dominating the political, economic, and social life of the people of a nation. You definitely should write that down as your definition of imperialism. Well, how does this pertain to Africa? In the mid-1800s, King Leopold of Belgium called a conference of the European powers. He called the conference so that they could avoid going to war over African colonies. And this was called the Berlin Conference. They met in Berlin. The reason they did this, like I said, was to prevent war. What did they do? They took the map of Africa and carved it up into colonies. However, the Africans weren't invited. They didn't invite the Swahili people or the Nok people or any other people of Africa to have any say in this. Basically, each European power had claims on the continent of Africa, and where they were conflicting, that's where they looked at the map and drew maps and decided what they wanted to, which colonies they wanted. And so Queen Victoria looked at a lake and said, "Oh, well, we want this," and they drew the line there. And if you look at Namibia and you see the strange outline of the country, the territory, you can see that there's this little tiny line of land that goes into, I believe it's Zambia, or is in Botswana. And that's because some European monarch wanted that piece of land. And Africans, even though they had a long history of ruling themselves, as we looked at in the Griot Tales, and so it's not like they were just these primitive peoples. Why did the European powers want colonies? Well, why do you think they wanted colonies? They needed raw materials for their industry. A lot of those European countries are small nations, and so they don't have the number of natural resources that the continent of Africa had. So they thought they would go in and take those resources, and then they would sell finished goods to the people that they conquered. And so it's a pretty sweet deal. You steal their resources, and then you make them buy the finished products from you. Another reason that countries wanted to have colonies was kind of to show how great they were in the world. There's the saying that the British ways are the ways of the world, my dear. Or Deutschland über alles, which is Germany over all. That, you know, if we have lots of colonies, it shows how powerful of a nation we are. Racism plays a role in this under the disguise of something called social Darwinism. If you know what Darwinism, and we'll just use the idea of natural selection, that's the strongest instincts survive, right? The strongest characteristics of a species will survive, and the weakest will be destroyed. Well, it's about this time that in the late 1800s, if you believe that humans are just another species of animal, then you can apply Darwinism to humans, and that's what social Darwinism is. So in other words, this was just the natural order that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christians or even Catholic Christians of Europe would dominate the colored primitive species of human in Africa, which really is just racism. There was also something called militarism, and at that time, the strongest countries had the biggest navies, not the Air Force. You know, there was no Air Force. A big army is good, but the strongest countries had the biggest navies. And ships were How were they powered at that time? Coal. And so you need coaling stations around the world, and you need naval bases around the world so that you can refuel your ships. And so having colonies on the coasts of Africa, in Asia, would provide for you those bases. So these are a number of reasons behind countries wanting to make colonies. Why did the Europeans succeed? Well, they succeeded primarily because they had a technological advantage with some of their weaponry, and that coupled with disunity of African peoples. Now, Africa is made up of many cultural groups, many different groups. Some were enemies of each other, some were friends. If large groups of African peoples would have united, they probably could have succeeded in sort of preventing the takeover. But Europeans were clever at pitting one side versus the other. In other words, if you help us in this fight against these people, we'll put you in positions of power. And so this unity plus the technological advantage helped Europeans succeed. When they conquered an area, they had a couple different options about how they might govern. One of the options was sphere of influence, and that means you just basically say, we have exclusive trading rights there. So it's not really a strong governance, it's not like a strong colony. It's more like our businesses are going to have a right to trade there exclusively. And you're a German, you stay out if we're the British. Another option is colony, and that's where you're almost complete control. You could have a protectorate, and that's where they would have their own government, but the foreign country would then control that government. So say, for example, Puerto Rico became a protectorate of the United States. They could have their own government, but we basically oversaw their government as kind of like a little brother of us, and we were the big brother, or the daddy, and they were the child. There's also something called economic imperialism. This was primarily used by the United States. The United States, if you look at a map of imperialism, they didn't conquer lots of different areas around the world, and you'll see in Africa there weren't any American colonies. But wherever the United States got involved, they used economic imperialism, which is basically United States businesses would go into those less developed nations and essentially become so powerful that the business almost controlled the politics of the country. For example, in Latin America, we have something called banana republics. And the banana republics are really like Dole Banana Company, Dole Pineapple, the controlling some of the countries there. So that's economic imperialism. And different countries use different methods in different regions of the world, depending on whatever met their fancy. Within those government options, there were management methods. You could use indirect control or direct control. The British often used indirect control, but not everywhere. This is where you use the local government. And you teach those people, or you use the local people, you teach them European styles of government and give them limited self-rule. Now, how do you choose the local leaders then? In Rwanda, for example, the Belgians and the Germans just chose people based on skin color. The Tutsi people were the minority, and the Hutus were the majority. However, they took the Tutsis and put them in control. So you had a minority group in control. And when eventually the Europeans leave, this is going to cause a problem. Actually, in Rwanda, they took the ones that were more European looking. So they took eye charts to look at eye color, lighter skin, taller people, more European featured, smaller nose, smaller lips. And they made them the people in charge because they were more European. Therefore, they must be more intelligent, according to the racism of the time. Also, another problem with choosing local leaders was the Europeans would go into a village or a region and say, who's your chief? Well, a lot of places in Africa used a heterarchy, which means you had different leaders for different topics or issues. For example, there might be a king over of agriculture and over war and over politics. And to come in and say, like the European monarchy, who's in charge didn't necessarily make sense. So they didn't really understand a lot of times the people they were dealing with. So that's indirect control. You could also use direct control, which the French used quite often. And there the goal is assimilation. In other words, you teach those people to be French. So in West Africa, where France colonized, you teach the people the French language, how to dress like the French, to eat like the French. Basically, you are French now. And they would use foreign rulers. So French nationals, white folks, would rule the nations. And the idea behind this is the idea of paternalism, the idea that these people are more primitive, they need our ways, they need to be taught how to be civilized, and kind of a fatherly way towards a child. I know what's best for you. And so you could rule in that way. Either way, it neglects the humanity of the people being colonized. Now, the Africans didn't just sit around and say, okay, we'll just get taken over. There were a lot of resistance efforts. If you look at page 783 in your book, you can see a map where the different resistance efforts were. Most of them, if not all of them in the textbook, are violent. And one year I had students do some research to see if they could find some nonviolent resistance efforts, and there's just not much evidence out there. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it just hasn't been recorded. Now, Ethiopia is one of the locations that resisted rule, and their leader was Menelik II. And when he came to power, he signed a treaty with the Italians, and he wanted to prevent the Italians from taking over the whole region of Ethiopia. And he signed a treaty with them. However, problems soon arose because in the Ethiopian language, Amharic, the understanding was that there was a less amount of land that Italy was supposed to control. In the Italian treaty, it made it look like they controlled more. And so Menelik actually renounced the treaty, and then he went through a series of maneuvers with European countries to get them on his side. He got France and Russia to be on his side. They gave him weapons. He made the rulers of Sudan friends with them so they wouldn't attack him. And then finally, in 1895, Menelik moved against the Italians. He gathered a large army and attacked the smaller Italian force. And in March of 1896, at the Battle of Andoa, the Italians were without supplies, disorganized, and they were fighting on a land that they didn't know, and they were outnumbered. Menelik crushed that army. 3/4 of the Italian force were killed, wounded, or captured, and other European nations looked at Menelik and Ethiopia as a powerful nation. Menelik ruled the country for another 20 years. He modernized the telephone and telegraph system, built a railroad, started a Western school system, and Ethiopia was able to maintain its independence during this age of imperialism, mostly because of his shrewd negotiations with Europeans and showing that he could be, that he was westernized, or I guess could adapt to Western ideas. How are the Africans treated? Well, I just have some excerpts from Belgian Congo rule, and I'm going to just go slowly through this so you can read it on your own. If you need to, you just stop this video every so often so that you can read this. But bottom line is, King Leopold, who ruled over the Belgian Congo, was ruthless, and basically millions of lives were lost while the Belgians controlled the Belgian Congo. So let me go slowly here and you can read this. This part on the wasted cartridges is unbelievable. Cutting off people's hands if they didn't, if for every So they wouldn't waste cartridges. They cut off the hands of living people. And then also the Leopold also bribed people to keep quiet. So that's a sad story. That's one story, but there would have been a number of other stories like that in other colonies throughout Africa. What were the effects? Yeah, I'm just going to list these, and we can talk maybe more fully about them later. But the immediate effects, colonial resources were exploited. They created one-crop economies, which means they didn't develop an economy. They just took whatever they wanted. So they'd plant wheat or cotton, and that's all they'd plant there. And they'd use that as a basis for the economy. So when they left, those countries are going to be left without any diversified economy. They're just going to have one-crop economies. Of course, the local population were treated poorly. A lot of disease was brought in, which brought death. When Europeans got involved in fights, those also then happened in
May I have your attention, please, for the afternoon
the
announcements. This is just a reminder
colonies.
that intramural soccer begins again tomorrow night. Please
I'll
make
let you
sure to
listen to the
check out the
announcements.
updated schedules that are posted. And would Noah Hostetler, Colin Samuel, and AJ Newcomer please come to the office? Thanks. Have a great afternoon.
And they spread the Christianity, which we consider a good thing, I would think. But there were some other problems with that as well. Long-range effects, traditional culture was broken apart. New transportation systems in colonies were built, which is a good thing, but the rails were usually built from the interior to the coast, not a vast network throughout the colonies, because they didn't need that. There was some improved health care. There was growth of nationalism, and as we see, the boundaries were arbitrarily drawn, have no reflection related to ethnic groups, warring groups, peaceful groups. They just divided them up the way they wanted, the Europeans did. So I would say that since the continent of Africa is often looked at as having a lot of major issues and problems, I think the imperialism had quite a bit to do with that. Thank you.